Welcome back to the Motorcyclist Podcast, where we talk about motorcycles and what makes them so great. As always, the topics on the show are constantly changing, but the one thing that remains is two-wheeled fun. In this episode, we're talking about electronics, more specifically, electronic rider aids. This isn't a super deep dive into like how they work, but more, or a history lesson on how they work, but more about like a general usage, what we think of them, and how we use them more and more and how we rely on them more and more. So if we were going to dive into the actual hardware and how they work, we would be here all day, if not a week. So we're going to skip that and we're just going to go into talking about them in general and go from there. So
you don't want to talk about like cell charts and all those things.
No, mapping and how an IMU works and how it talks to an ECU. No. So then we're going to talk about how they've evolved. Basically, like we've been around since the beginning of many of these rider aids, and we've seen them evolve throughout the years. And then we're going to get into some like really recent evolutions of rider aids, like Ducati's new Ducati Vehicle Observer or DVO system, and Bosch's new Advanced Rider Assistance System. So before we get to that, always got to have some introductions. We've got Adam Wahid, editor. We've got Bradley Adams, in-market editor, and you got myself, executive editor, Justin Dawes. So let's start out with what we always do. What's everyone been riding? So Adam, what have you been riding?
I've been riding BMW's 2024 R1300 GS, but this isn't just any GS. This is the 719 option GS with the
fancy one.
Yeah, the one with the upgraded bling bling, billet pieces on it, and geez, it looks beautiful. It's a beautiful looking bike, and it rides just as well as it looks.
It's kind of crazy how many variants there are of that bike, right?
There's so many packages. It is pretty
crazy, dude. Yeah.
They've given you a bajillion ways to spend money on that motorcycle.
Yeah.
It's a perfect way of putting it. Yeah.
Yeah. It's funny too, because every different configuration, obviously they look the same, but when you put street bike tires on it rather than enduro bike tires, it kind of changes the look of the bike, the different colors. This particular model I'm operating has got this like almost Triumph like forest green paint, which is a lot different than their, motorsports blue. And it really looks different. I always just like, what? Like that's the same bike? It's really amazing what a different paint job and some, bling bling parts can do to a bike.
Oh yeah, absolutely. Yeah. They've made it fully customizable for many different uses. So kind of cool.
I still want to do a day where we talk about, can you actually buy a base model BMW?
Yeah, you can. You're just going to have to wait like 6 months to get it.
Yeah,
they'll order it.
They actually make them. They're not. Yeah,
they'll order it for you, and then it'll be in the line till it's built. So
yeah.
What have you been riding, Bradley?
Actually, I wanted to bring up Triumph Speed 400. So we got that at the office, and obviously, yeah. So a little bit of kind of commuting on the other parts of our business stuff we've been doing. We're looking at best bikes that we've been riding throughout the year, our top bikes for the year, and that one came up in conversation a lot. So been spending some time. We have one of those at the office. Been spending some time on that, and I'll be honest, it's a really good bike. I think when we were looking at best bikes for the year, it didn't quite make the cut just because there's some other stuff in that small displacement category. The Aprilia RS 457 that I've talked about, I think an episode or two ago, but you got to give credit to that Speed 400 because such a great little bike. I think the only reason we didn't pick it, and in what I've learned in the riding of it, is it's a little bit the versatility of it. If you are doing longer rides, stuff where you're actually on the highway for a bit, it's out of its comfort zone, and obviously you don't have the wind protection and things like that. But it's like a city bike and something that a new rider can just get on, and the affordability of it.
Yeah, it's pretty rad.
Is really good.
It was one of my favorites of 2014, or 2024.
14, yeah. You were ahead of the curve there.
2024, absolutely. So, for me, I'm on boss duty end of the year. I got lots of stuff to do. I've been writing the computer a lot, writing reviews of guys like Adam, his end of the year reviews, doing the corporate BS. But I did get out on my KTM and do some hard enduro. spent like 5 hours riding like maybe 6-7 miles. So just frying
there's
clutches.
Some seat time.
Yeah, there's some seat time. Yeah, it was a lot of lifting, and it's a good workout because you're constantly pushing and lifting and moving. So it's good to get out there and do it. But I'm definitely looking forward to the end of the year and then getting back into testing bikes myself, because as much as I love riding my KTM out in the woods, I do want to get my butt on some new bikes.
Yeah.
So anyway, so we should get into
new bikes.
Let's do it.
New bikes, new electronics,
Mm-hmm.
all the things.
Yes.
All the things that make new bikes special.
Yep.
That's what bikes are all about
I
these days.
I should say we're talking new bikes, but you know me, I like to go in, do a little research. So I was doing a little research coming into our electronics talk.
You always overdo it.
Always, it's the Bradley way. Yeah, so I figured we'd start with like a little bit of a history. I know we don't want to make this whole history lesson on electronics, but like it's the foundation and it's part of the story of how we got to where we're at now. So going back, obviously, I think one of the big things we're going to be talking about today is traction control, right? Because there's been massive evolutions in that. So going back, I mean, it's interesting because it really kind of depends on how you define traction control, and if you're looking at, race bikes or limited production bikes or production bikes. But really, the history of traction control as we know it kind of starts in 2008. So really the first one, there's kind of that a little bit of a question mark in terms of what was the first bike with traction control. Technically, in a lot of ways, it was the Ducati 1098R in 08. Kind of a weird thing because it was essentially like a race version of the bike. It was limited production, and actually you had to have the race ECU and exhaust on that bike in order to have TC.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, that was really one of the first ones where, as testers for the magazine, guys were going out. They had an event out at Jerez, and that was really the first chance to really sample traction control. And it was, crude in a lot of ways, although that Ducati system was adjustable. I think you had 8 levels. And that was the really cool part about that. And I think this is cool because it'll come back in other parts of this conversation. It was Ducati pulling from their race bikes, right? Mm-hmm. It was Ducati pulling technology and systems from their MotoGP program, from World Superbike, and applying it to not really a production bike, but in a lot of ways, a bike that, the consumer could get. So that was cool, I think. And then, 08 was really that big year. You had the Kawasaki ZX-10R, mm-hmm. Which is really what a lot of guys at the time were considering the first traction control system for a mass production sport bike.
Yeah.
In a lot of ways, again, that was a very crude system. I think they called it KIMS. It was ignition management system, mm-hmm. And relatively limited. And Kawasaki, and a lot of these Japanese manufacturers in the past, they don't really want to call them traction control.
Ignition management system. Like there's not a T in that whole acronym whatsoever.
Yeah, so, right. But that really was what we know as that was really the start of traction control, controlling traction and grip, mm-hmm. Through electronic management on a mass production sport bike. So the other thing I want to say, it's kind of cool because I think it'll shape a lot of this conversation. It was interesting reading some of the first ride reviews during that time because they almost just breezed right past it. Like it was so crude in so many ways, and nobody really understood how to take advantage of it,
and everyone turned it off.
Exactly,
a lot, especially like very skilled riders that are there for a magazine test. A lot of them, okay, yeah, cool, whatever, and then they would turn it off because it didn't do exactly what they wanted it to do. It would actually slow you down.
Yeah.
Right. Instead of like being able to spin the tire up a little bit and get out of a corner while sliding, it would just cut your power a bit, and you couldn't get off the corner as hard. So everyone would turn it off.
Yeah. And then obviously you go into situation. Right. Yeah. And that was the thing, a lot of it was especially with that Ducati, it was very track oriented, and then obviously you had 09, right? You start mm-hmm. looking at BMW S1000 when that comes in, Aprilia RSV4, and that really, I think, is what started the electronics arms race mm-hmm. that really defines motorcycling nowadays.
For sure.
As far as ABS, because that's going to be another big thing.
Yeah, I mean, ABS, arguably, I think, a more important rider aid than traction control.
Probably, and there's a lot more history to it, right? You go back to 1988, BMW K100, and that was, again, relatively crude system and complex. I was going back, the hardware for that thing was like 22 pounds. They're adding on.
It was because it was basically a car system that was put into the bike. Like instead of making a small one like they do now, where it's a motorcycle unit, so it's much smaller, more compact. They were just like, let's shoehorn this thing that's out of a BMW car into the bike,
And that's the thing. I think that's, again, part of this conversation is understanding that you have to start somewhere. And then now, you get to where we're at now. Another thing I did want to call out was KTM and Bosch in 2014 on the 1190 Adventure. That's when you started getting your cornering ABS. And that's, I think from there, we're seeing stuff start to happen at a really rapid rate, and kind of gets us to where we're at today, with electronic systems. And obviously a big thing was in 2016, in Europe, they started requiring, it was mandatory for all motorcycles over 125 cc's to have ABS, absolutely mandatory. And so obviously that's trickled over to the US because they're just going to, you can still buy some bikes without ABS, but it's really dictated.
Yeah.
Where we're at in motorcycling right now.
Some of the Japanese manufacturers offer an ABS and a non-ABS model, right? And you see that in like the Honda and Kawasaki naming convention, where they'll just add ABS to the end of the name of the bike to let you know it has ABS. But they're getting few and farther between, especially with the ABS laws in Europe. They just keep it's going all the way down to eventually everything's going to have ABS on it, including bicycles. So,
So all that is to say that I think my big two takeaways are, well, one with the traction control especially, is how far we've come in a relatively short amount of time. Like, honestly, if you look back, it doesn't seem like that long ago that we just, we're seeing that Kawasaki, the Kim system, or, stuff with the Ducati. And then again, starting in 2009, really with S1000 and things like that. And now where we're at, where all of these different electronic systems, and they're all split. It's not just TC. You've got TC, slide control, and then you go into engine braking, all of these other systems that you've got now, and they're so advanced. And we got predictive systems that we'll talk about. But it's pretty impressive how quickly these things evolve.
Absolutely.
It's really worth mentioning, why. I mean, we have all these rider aids now, but why were these rider aids even put on these vehicles back in the beginning? Let's talk about that.
Yeah, and that was a big thing back in the day, right? Because everyone's that, you're taking away my control. And
back in the day, people still argue that, and we'll talk about that probably later. But people still talk about that, like, you're taking away my control. It's all right here in the wrist. It's right here. Everything's right here. I don't need no traction control.
Well, we saw a thing from one of the vice presidents of the two-wheel division at Bosch, right? Some quotes for them in an article and talking about electronics that I think we thought was interesting, right?
For sure. It's cool, to see, how the whole evolution of the scene, went from devices to make riding at the limit easier, have now kind of morphed into these safety devices to allow just you to operate the bike just by a greater range of operators. So whether you're a professional rider or you're someone who's just new to riding, you can ride these bikes to the limit, your limit, more aptly without doing anything crazy. I mean, remember back in the day when, beginnings of ABS on these motorcycles, you would actuate the brake and the lever would start pulsing and you really weren't stopping. And you're like, what is this? This doesn't even work. And now these systems have gotten so good. I mean, look at the modern Ducati superbikes and Aprilia superbikes. You have to be riding these bikes at such an extreme level for the ABS to even kick in. It's crazy.
Yeah, and I think that's always been the goal of electronics. It's really, well, especially in the early days, it was traction control, ABS. It was really about having that layer of protection at the limit. It was supposed to be, once you have found the limit of the bike, then they came in and were supposed to kind of save you. Whereas now I think they've become so refined that they are actually helping you throughout all of the process of riding and allowing you, especially on the track,
Yeah.
I should say, obviously, I'm always going to go back to track stuff, but it's meant to allow you to go faster and help with the lap time. I think they really do aid in lap times nowadays. I think
there's the point of a lot of these rider aids. There's some that are rider aids that are, like quick shifters and stuff like that are not safety systems as well as rider aids. But then there's the rider aids that are always there to kick in at the extreme limits of anything, whether that be on the street or on the track, right? So traction control on the track, you're doing your thing. You're trying to get every ounce of traction out of the bike to get off the corner the quickest. On the street, ABS, you have an emergency situation, ABS kicks in. There's a lot of it that's in the background now that's become more and more transparent compared to the old days, like Adam said, where you'd feel the lever kick back at you and you're like, oh my God, I'm not stopping. And, traction control that would feel like someone grabbed the back of your leathers or your jacket and pulled you as you were trying to accelerate, So, there's something to be said for, the safety part of it, but also the everyday things like quick shift and hill hold and power modes and launch control and now adaptive cruise control. All those things are a whole nother subset of rider aids that we'll talk about that are there to make your life easier. But there's the stuff that makes your life safer.
I'm glad you mentioned hill hold, because you can laugh at me all you want. When a bike has hill hold, I'm in love. Every time I come to the stoplight, activate hill hold, and I can just sit there, that peace of mind. I don't have to worry about the thing moving at all, in a neutral. I love hill hold. I use it all the time. I think it's such a cool thing. I don't use it for going up and down hills. I'm just sitting at a stoplight and bike just locks in and you're like, okay, cool.
Yeah, for sure. So there's something like these high horsepower bikes that we're riding a lot now, especially the big super bikes. And even the larger bikes that have a lot of torque, you don't want to turn the riders up. We're very skilled riders and we don't want to turn them off that often. We'll turn them off to do wheelies and skids and stuff for photos, but if we're actually trying to ride the bike, we really don't want to turn them off anymore because the bikes are so potent and powerful, and at the same time that it's just a safety net to keep you safe while you're riding. So, and we see that at press launches, we see less crashes at press events. Back in the day, people were binning bikes left and right at press launches, especially a track launch, right?
Yeah, I wasn't there, but I've heard stories of almost every event that you would go to, first ride events at a track, and there would be bikes going into the dumpster because just multiples at a time, and obviously there's been, growth in terms of seeing things like tires and suspension. I think that helps a little bit. But we talk about this, outside of, this conversation here, we've talked a lot about how much fewer crashes there are nowadays at these events you go to. And a lot of us do associate that with the evolution of electronics. Absolutely. I firmly believe that the fewer crashes that we see, obviously we're riding a lot of these different events and things like that. And we just see a lot fewer crashes. And actually, I think, now that I think about it, I think there was some, I wouldn't say a quote, but there's been stories from California Superbike School when they went over to the transition to the BMWs and had, all these rider aids for those bikes, that they were actually seeing fewer crashes at their instruction days. And they associated that
I remember hearing that
with the electronic rider aids. So,
for sure. We went, you and Bradley and I, we both went to the Conti Drome in 2010, 11. It's a testing area for Continental tires. And they had a road course that had standing water on it that was inches deep around the whole course. And it was really interesting to ride a bunch of different bikes, because at that time there was bikes with TC and ABS, and there was bikes without, and the bikes without were really difficult to ride around that track. And then the ones with TC, you would just go, you just snap the throttle hard as you want and it would figure it out. And then you'd slam on the brakes and you wouldn't tuck the front. Then you get on something that didn't have it and you were on the edge of crashing the whole time.
Yeah.
So
No, absolutely. And I think that's really the big part of this conversation. I hope that's going to be a big takeaway for all of you out there listening is, we have had the opportunity, as hopefully maybe you have too, to see the evolution of these systems. And we'll be the first to admit that the early systems, we'd get on the bikes and pretty quickly turn them off. If not turn them off, we're going to level 1, like as little intervention as you can. And
I think Adam still does that a lot of times.
Well, now a lot of times, honestly, it's hard to even do that. Like the menu systems on these bikes are crazy complicated. A lot of these settings are buried. They don't have, remember, they used to have like a button, like everything off button. Now they don't really have everything off button. Now you have to go in the menu, you have to go in the sub menu, you have to find the track control, you have to turn that off, and you have to turn off wheelie control, and you have to turn off this control, and you have to turn on that control. And it's a lot more complicated than it used to be. But to be fair, these things are pretty good now where you don't really even need to turn them off.
No,
you know?
I think we've definitely gotten to a point where engineers, it's like the dashes and the menu systems have had to catch up, right? Because they just started adding all of these electronic rider aids, and like all of a sudden you're limited on space, with your switch clusters and in the dash and these menus. And I do think we are getting to a point now where it's starting to catch up. We're seeing the joysticks solution pop up a lot more. Yamaha's been good about that. Ducati now, where it's a lot easier to navigate menus, and you don't have like one button trying to operate 4 different systems.
Right.
So
and then
we are getting to a point. But
on
really,
BMW's system, you actually can assign a button to one of those functions that you use a lot. You can assign it onto a single button on the cluster too. So if there's one that you want to use a lot, you can assign that button and get to it, which is kind of nice too.
Yeah.
But
I did. You briefly mentioned it, but I did have a story for this podcast here that I wanted to mention, which was going to the Panigale V4S press launch this last year, and obviously it had DVO, the predictive system that we'll get into. But so we basically rode all day. And the last session of the day, they're like, hey, we're going to have a photographer outside of this corner. It's basically he's there to snap wheelie photos. So for this session, go ahead and turn the wheelie control off. And then when you get to that section, pop the front wheel up and you'll get a cool action photo. And man, what a commitment that is on a bike like the Panigale V4S. Like I legitimately was thinking, I don't really want to turn this system off because these things are so potent nowadays. They will bite you. They will absolutely bite you if you do not have the electronics on. And you have to ride so much more diligently and more careful and be really, smooth with your inputs. And I remember coming out of this corner, and you see the photographer, and I go to pop the front wheel up, and that thing just snaps up like vertical. I had actually whittled down my photo selections because the first time I did it, the thing's like straight up and down, and I look like a goon because I'm like, it's way more than just like a cool power wheelie.
Right. It doesn't look like you're going fast around the track. It looks like you're just stunting.
We're trying to ride the rest of the track with the systems off, and I wanted to tell that story because I'm an experienced rider with a lot of history riding sport bikes, and it's basically gotten to a point where these bikes are so potent, the systems are so good, I don't want to turn them off. Mm-hmm. I don't even go to the lowest level anymore. I mean, we're somewhere in that 3-4 range, honestly, on some of these systems where I'm like, that's good because the intervention has smoothed out so much. You're not getting that choppiness off, when you're accelerating off a corner.
Yeah.
It's very natural and a smooth feel.
That's speaking of choppiness, this is a good place to put in my story of going to Sonoma to watch AMA Superbike racing, probably 2007, 2008, maybe 2006.
The heyday.
And Mladen was when Mladen was just waxing everyone. And I was up at like corner 4. It's a right-hander kind of over a crest. And he was coming over that thing, and you would hear the traction control working on that Pizzazz system that was on that bike, it wasn't like a dimming of the power. It wasn't like a whoa, whoa, whoa. It was like da 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 da. Like it was just cutting ignition so quickly, and it sounded crazy, and it was like, I mean, it worked for him, but it couldn't have been the most smooth thing, and it absolutely wasn't the best way to do it, as we've gotten better, but at the time, that's what it was basically like just stop the wheel from spinning for fractions of a second, and it's going to be better than it's spinning all the time.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it was funny actually. In preparation for this, I was going back and reading some stories. I stumbled across a story by Sam Fleming, who ran the Army of Darkness endurance racing program. Really bright individual who I think we've all got to ride with and work with. And he was basically doing an in-depth review of the Bazaz electronics system, the Bazaz TC, basically, right, at the time. And he did a really great job talking about the system. But and essentially that was a rate of change. And it actually looked at crankshaft speed. So rate of change of the crankshaft, and seeing the spike and understanding like, hey, if the crankshaft is now spiking in this way, crankshaft speed is spiking in this way, it's probably overwhelming tires. So, and that's when they were making the cut. And he was talking about building a TC map at the time. And I was like, I think this was in about 2010. And I was thinking, if only he would have known where things are going now. You know, that system at the time, it was like, wow, look at all this stuff we can do, and we can adjust these cells. And you know, they were trying to figure out how to build maps and stuff. And it's just like, God, and that's again, how far we've come in a relatively short period.
Let's talk about how far we've come now. I mean, let's talk about predictive rider aid systems like the new Ducati DVO, and now Aprilia's announced one as well. You've got actual experience riding that bike, Bradley. So, you know, it's basically a system that uses the system it has now, and it predicts what the bike's going to do before it does it. And it's mimicking, it doesn't have 70 sensors, but it like basically mimics like there's like 70 sensors on the bike. So it's figuring out all this crazy stuff. So, but in terms of actually like how it works and how it feels, you're the one to tell us.
I want to preface this by saying, yes, I do. I sat down with one of the electronic engineers at Ducati during the Panigale launch, and I probably sat down with him for an hour. And I mean, some of it even still goes over my head, and it's hard to wrap your head around. And I definitely don't want to make this an in-depth of how predictive systems work, because I definitely don't want to mess that up. But really, these are data-driven systems in a lot of ways. So we've gotten to a point now where these manufacturers have been doing it for so long. They have so much data to input into the computer where they're able to build out a model that says it's a motorcycle dynamics model, really. And it essentially tells the computer how much torque the motorcycle can handle given all of these different parameters. So it's reading, obviously lean angle, throttle position, all of these other systems. And it says, based on where all of these systems are at and my understanding of what the motorcycle can handle, here's how much torque I can provide. And that's a very simple way of explaining it. But I think the important thing to understand is that these systems are made possible because of the surplus of data that they have and the ability to go into computers and program out the dynamic model and understand. And then now all you're doing is applying it in the real world by saying, okay, based on this situation that you're in right now, the motorcycle can handle this much torque.
Right.
The really cool part of this that I think is the important aspect of it is it turns the system again into a predictive system versus a reactive. So no longer are you getting into a situation where now you've got slip and then the computer's trying to react to regain traction, to regain traction. So it's working ahead of time. So the bikes never really get out of shape in the way that they would have before. So the computers are constantly monitoring where traction levels are, how much torque is being offered. And so you never have the system never has to come in and really shut things down, because then that's where you're getting those really big cuts. So now that's where obviously you're getting refinement through the way the systems are operating, but it's also because you're not having to take these big chunks out and fix a problem that the rider has created by grabbing a handful of throttle, essentially. So predictive versus reactive is really where we're at now, and you're not reacting to big losses in traction. You kind of see it coming and you're adjusting ahead of time. And that's really the big thing.
So what does it actually feel like to ride though? That's the important part. Like all that is it's super rad tech, but in the end, when you're on the track, how does it work?
I want to make a joke and say that you don't feel it. But that's, I think to go deeper, I think the best way to describe it is natural. I think that's the key word to describe the modern electronics and predictive systems like what we're seeing on the Ducati and now actually the Aprilia superbikes. Very natural. You don't feel the cuts. You just don't. I remember there was a corner, so we were riding the Panigale V4 at Vallelunga circuit. It's got a couple of little tight corners that you're accelerating hard off of on the side of the tire. And I could feel the tire squirming and sliding. And I know the TC is working. I know your slide control is working, but you never actually feel a cut. It's just managing how much you're sliding. And it's doing it in such a refined manner that you're not actually feeling the electronics. You're feeling what the tire is doing. And you're understanding that the computer has it under control. But you're never getting these big movements. You're never getting everything is very natural and fluid, and it's all kind of working in the background. And that's where I say that these systems are allowing you, they're helping you win a lap time. Right. They're not saving you from a big high side and things like that. They are actually helping manage that drive and allowing you to drive forward. And that's where I say that they're actually helping you go faster, which has been the biggest evolution, I think.
They're making you a better rider than you are. In a way.
In a way, yes. Yeah, in a way. I mean, I think they're allowing you to do things. You ride the bikes different with modern electronics. You have to. And that's actually been a really hard thing for me as someone who kind of grew up in a sport bike era where you didn't have the electronics. And everything I know about riding a motorcycle and what my dad always taught me was always about being as smooth as you possibly can, right? Managing traction, front or rear, by the actions that you're taking with the brake lever or the throttle. And now it's really hard because a system now, you crack the throttle and you've got to you just get on the throttle as soon as you possibly can. And that's where you're letting the systems work. So, I mean, it's changed the riding style a lot, and it's actually hard. I think for a lot of people to wrap their head around.
So instead of it making you a better rider than you are, it's allowing you to devote less brain power to traction management and more towards riding.
100%. And I think actually, if you take that, you switch that conversation over to, it's a much easier to wrap your head around auto blip downshift. And I think that's been, I love that technology. I remember the first time riding a really good auto blip downshift going into turn 1 at Willow on a leader bike. I was on an R1 at the time, and just grabbing the brake lever and not having to think about blipping the throttle and being as smooth as I possibly could be with the downshifts. It was just click the shift lever and it's done. You don't have to think about how smooth am I being with my blips, all that. Now, all of that focus, all that energy, that mental energy that I would have exhausted thinking about that stuff, I can think about my brake application, how I'm releasing the brake lever, making sure I'm online, all of those things. And I think that's a big thing with electronics, where it gives you some added mental capacity to focus on other things. Using that traction control and coming off a corner as an example, rather than thinking about how smooth am I being with the throttle and driving off, it allows you to use that little bit extra, mental energy on something else.
Yeah. So
you're working with a computer nowadays. Yeah.
Yeah. I this year went to Japan with Bosch. Speaking of, instead of saving you extra mental energy or whatever, sometimes you have a lapse of mental energy and you're not thinking and something goes wrong. And so I got to test all these systems that were meant to save your butt when stuff goes wrong, on top of some other comfort features. But Bosch has their system is called Advanced Rider Assistance Systems, or RS. And it's basically built around the radar, the ABS module, the IMU, the ECU, the dash, like all these things, front and rear radar. And it's building the system that helps you like in the day-to-day stuff. You've got adaptive cruise control, and we've all tried it, and the first go of them, they're cool if like you're behind a car or directly behind a motorcycle, but when you got like offline from a bike or something, like it wouldn't see the bike and you'd almost like graze the person in front of you. So now this new system, like the radars are smaller, they're lighter, but they have like a new, what they call a chirp sequence, which is like the way the radar sees. And it's more accurate at measuring distances, and it can identify multiple targets now, instead of just before it would know there was one car in front of you or one motorcycle. Now it can go, okay, there's two bikes staggered in the lane, and they have a group riding adaptive cruise control setting that you can turn it on and be staggered and not run past the person that's in the other half of the lane, because it's not picking up the person in front. It knows where that person is, but it also knows the next person that's the person that you're supposed to be pacing off of. And the bikes can move around in front of you and it still doesn't get confused. And it's nice for like long distance cruising. And it just allows you once again to devote brain power to maybe something else and be a little less fatigued while you're riding. But then it gets into a lot of other cool features they can do with it. And one of them is you can set the cruise control with a stop and go feature for people that can't split lanes. So it has to be an automatic bike to do it. So we rode a prototype KTM with the AMT automatic transmission in it. And you'd set the thing, and we followed a car, and I set the cruise control at 80 miles an hour, and we were going around this oval, and the car would just stop in front of you, and you didn't touch the brakes or anything, and the bike would completely come to a stop on its own. And then the car would move off, and you had to either slightly crack the throttle or press the cruise control button, and the bike would take off on its own. It was wild. And so I was like, oh, well, let's see if like, what would happen if you hit the takeoff button before the car in front of you moved. So I did that, and it just sat there. And then when the car moved, you just immediately started going again. So like in like stop and go traffic for someone that's commuting a lot, I think it'd be a super rad system. But it is quite eerie for the bike to stop and start itself completely on its own. Right? Super weird.
Yeah. It's like now we're coming back into that conversation of where we were back in 2008 when TC systems were coming out, I think now more than ever, of how much control do we give the computers, right?
Yes.
Versus the rider. And that is an interesting conversation to have.
Yep.
Speaking of, I was curious, what are your guys' thoughts on the emergency braking systems? Because I'll be honest, I am still not sold.
Dude, that was the other, like I am massively sold on it after going to this Bosch thing.
Yeah.
They had an emergency braking assist system that uses the radar, to figure out how fast you're closing on something. And it will, what Bosch found out in their research is that most people don't hit the brakes too hard in emergency situations. They don't hit them hard enough. They don't use all the traction. So,
interesting.
So what happens is this system now will automatically, if it senses a collision is about to happen and you're applying the brakes, it will apply the maximum braking on its own to the limit of traction of ABS. So you get every single bit of the maximum traction you can get on the bike. And it is the craziest thing. We followed this van and had this beach ball hanging off the side of it that it was on a swing away in case you didn't slow down, right? But you never would, because the system works so good. So you're riding at this van, you're going 50, it's going 30, and then you're like coming up on it, and then the van hits the brakes, and then on the dash there was a warning like brake, and if you didn't hit the brakes within like a half a second, then the seat would vibrate to tell you, yo, you're gonna crash. And then you hit the brakes, and as you're going, it'll just give you full maximum braking power. And so I was like, well, let's see how this works. And the first time you do it, you give it, if you're a good rider, you give it all the brake and you do it on your own. You're like, I didn't feel anything. okay, this next time I'm going to use like half the braking power. And I did it, and it completely stopped the bike on its own with me just like, you could feel the lever come in on its own. So I'm pulling the lever like halfway of what I need, and the bike just goes, no, you need more. And the lever moves and goes all the way to maximum. And then I made a game of trying to hit the beach ball, and the system wouldn't let me do it. It was super rad. It was amazing.
It's so funny because I feel like the people from 08 that are like, nah, I got this. Like, I'm better than you at this. But the reality is, and I think this is obviously, we're just in the early stages of these systems. These systems are so good now that it is better than us. It's quicker than us, in a lot of ways, and then, or at least 90% of the riding public, right? I think these systems have evolved to a point where, let's be honest, they can react in ways that we as humans can't sometimes. So what do you think, Adam, about the transition of all of this technology? Because we're talking about really high-end motorcycles. You mentioned Panigale V4s and Aprilia RS V4s and, the KTM and things like that. But what about how much we've seen trickle down into small bikes? Because I think that's a big thing for motorcycling. I mean, we see TC and ABS and cornering ABS on entry-level machines at this point, right?
I mean, they're just prevalent in all aspects of power sports now, but really what we should talk about is, that's really crazy technology. But do you guys think that all of this cutting edge technology is now taking some of the inherent skill out of operating a motorcycle? Like, now you could say, Justin, that operating these products is very much almost like a video game. Is this going to create a world where now motorcyclists are more unsafe because they don't have the fundamental motor skills to operate these vehicles? They're just relying on the electronics like a video game.
So on those emergency systems, I would say no, because they're so far in the background and they're at the very limit of safety, and like that automatic braking system doesn't work every time, right? It's only if you're like screwing up that it does the thing. And I think that the opposite can be argued, that with these systems, it allows you to become a better rider because you ride for longer, safer. You don't have an accident. You don't get out of the sport. You don't get injured.
Interesting.
So that's what I would argue, because it's still not doing the core thing of riding a motorcycle for you, right? It's not changing, needing to learn body position, learning to look down the road, learning the proper way to take a corner, learning the proper way to position yourself to be safe, all those other things. You still have to learn those things, but this just like covers your butt so that you don't get taken out early out of the sport.
I think it's a natural evolution that we see in all aspects of life. I mean, technology infiltrates, every part of our world, right? And I think you have to evolve with it. I mean, we sit and write stories every day, right? Do you really want to sit down and write your story on pen and paper, Adam? Or, I mean, computer makes it faster and you're more efficient, right? And technology helps us be more efficient. You have to use it wisely and in the right ways, but it is a tool for us to be better at what we do. And I'm not saying that just in terms of motorcycling, but I think you can apply that same philosophy to motorcycling. You can't just completely turn your brain off. I think that's the thing. I think that's the thing we love about motorcycles. It's not like getting in a car where you get in your cage, you put your seatbelt on, and you just kind of like turn your music up and you zone out, right? And as you hum down the road, you're still engaged in everything you do and you're doing these actions. And I think in motorcycling, we should never forget that we are, you're constantly doing things and you need to be mindful of the inputs you're making. It's not right. The bike's not going to ride for us. But the technology helps us, I think, right? And you have to use it. You should use it, right? I don't know. I'm not saying that as a sure thing. It's just my opinion.
Well, I mean, like Adam, like how it's a bit of a challenge to let your brain trust these systems at the same time, right?
Yeah, I mean, for sure. I mean, Bradley had mentioned that previously, like, especially on the racetrack when you're operating these vehicles, you're operating them in a different manner. If you're more of an old school motorcyclist, it's going to take you some time to even understand how to operate that bike on track, because like you said, you have to almost kind of trust the electronics, and trusting, the machine can be difficult for everyone, myself included, but realistically, like, opening the throttle immediately, actuating the brakes immediately, like just doing all these things, you kind of have to literally put your faith in the machine to get the most out of it. If you just want to ride and have fun and be safe, you can totally go mellow. But if you really want to, go crazy fast and use the bike to its maximum potential, you have to rely on that machine. And that's kind of like almost the new generation of riders. You kind of see it almost in MotoGP, and just, I mean, you've seen it for a while now, but like people who just full faith in the electronics, hold it wide all the time, let the machine sort it out.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. What do you guys think about the future of electronics? I mean, we've talked about the evolution and how we got to where we're at now, but I mean, you look at machine learning and AI and vehicle to vehicle communication, all of those things. And God, it seems like we've still got, I wouldn't say a long way to go, but there's still a lot of stuff that can be introduced to motorcycles that we probably haven't even thought of yet.
Yeah.
Right?
When I was at that Bosch thing, I was picking the engineers' brains. Like, we got like in a car ride for a while, and as we were switching bikes, they only had so many bikes. So like, you had to ride and then you get in a car for a while. And so you could do interviews while you were in the car. And, I was picking his brain of like, what's next? And, what about vehicle communication? And he was like, yeah, it's possible, but it has to be adopted by everything to make it safe. Right. If 90% of vehicles have vehicle to vehicle communication, there's still 10% that's just going to get smoked. Mm-hmm. You know what I mean? It's not going to work. So he's like, that's a long way off for that, just because of the adoption. But there's a lot of other things that are probably possible. And, I was like, what about like GPS and like knowing where you're at on a road and he was like, he was very cagey because they're working on a lot of stuff, and he wouldn't give me a lot of answers, but you could tell like some of the ideas I had, they had thought of a long time ago. And they're just like, you are so simple, dude. Like, that was 20 years ago that we thought of that, so.
Yeah. And at the production bike level, for sure, I mean, you could only imagine what they have in GP. And obviously, even, I mean, sometimes we forget because it is at the pinnacle of the sport, but an Aprilia RSV4, you can do corner by corner adjustment through their, it has GPS on it, and you can set the bike up to have different electronic intervention levels at different sections of the track. Right? And I mean, at what point do you get to, that's obviously you pre-programming. At what point is it where the bike already knows, what it needs to do at different areas of the track, and it's adjusting in real time or something, which is, I mean, that probably isn't that far off, given that you already have section by section adjustments.
Yeah, exactly. And you've got the GPS connection and all that stuff. So I'm sure that eventually can apply itself to roads or something like that, where like it knows like, okay, this corner is very tight and this corner is less tight, that you're coming up to. And the data has told us that this corner, there's been 27 motorcycle accidents in the last year. So we're going to crank up the safety in this corner for you. And then the next corner, there's been no accidents. So we're just going to let you be free. You know what I mean? I could see that happening way down the road, but it is definitely possible. But I mean, right now, Honda's DCT is a good example. It kind of like learns your habits, right? It learns how you want to use the bike, and it recognizes some trends on how you're shifting the bike or asking the bike to do things, and it'll kind of prioritize those things. So it's not necessarily learning, but more prioritization of what you're doing more often, and it recognizes those trends.
I think, if I remember correctly, Adam, and maybe that the Can-Ams that we recently rode, the new Can-Am electric bikes, there was some aspect of that in those. Even it understood your riding dynamics, and it tailored its performance based on its understanding of your riding, which is, so yeah, in some ways we are already there, and it'll continue to evolve.
Yeah, the world's changing fast. I could almost see like, Tesla, you were talking about, Justin, about the Bosch gentleman not saying, oh, it'd have to be adopted by everyone. I mean, think about this. Tesla makes open source code for vehicle to vehicle communication, open source. Everyone tweaks it. Everyone has access to it. That's exactly how that would all work. As long as everyone wanted to run that program.
Yeah.
But I mean, like, just all that stuff's coming, and just think about it. I mean, taking the human out of the equation, I know that sounds ridiculous, but taking the human out of the equation, especially in terms of, four-wheeled vehicles, it's really going to help, for just everyday
Absolutely.
street.
Yeah.
I actually have a really funny story that happened like an hour and a half ago when I was driving here to the office. So like I'm in traffic on the 5, brutal traffic on a Thursday, and so traffic, I'm in the fast lane, slows down pretty quick. And I get on the brakes, and every time, I think most people driving a car, your first reaction, okay, I'm managing the gap in front of me, make sure I'm stopping, but I'm also looking in my rearview mirror to make sure I'm almost managing that gap behind me, right? Make sure, okay, I need to let off the brake a little bit to widen that gap if that car's coming up fast. I look back, and it's a Tesla behind me. And right away, initially, I'm like, oh, that car's got it. I'm good. I don't have to worry about getting rear-ended, because I'm like, that car is going to adjust and make sure that it does not hit me. It was a really weird feeling. And it's the irony that we were coming in today to talk about electronics. And I was like, that's kind of cool. That's kind of cool. And I didn't even think about the driver at all, right? I wasn't thinking about, that's a good driver. I was like, oh, that car's got it. That car will not hit me.
Yeah, that's funny.
That was interesting. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. And I mean, Tesla has improved those systems, because there was a few cases of them actually smacking motorcycles in the early days of the.
Yeah. Or there was like a semi, right? With like paintings on the back, right? Or like, wrapped, and they saw like clouds. They like confused, or like a white back of a truck, and they like confused it with clouds or something. Like, oh no, it's clear. And then,
exactly. So it's not completely foolproof, but it gets better all the time, and the speed at which it gets better is all time. And Adam was saying, like, taking the human out of the equation, great for cars. Motorcycle manufacturers are clear that they don't want to remove the rider from the equation. Like they want you to enjoy the motorcycle through the electronics, and they're just helping you. And that's the key takeaway, is that electronics have come a long way. They're smaller, they're lighter, they're less intrusive. They're there in the background to help you. Sure, back in the day, teething issues were there, and you could outperform some of the systems, but now you can't. They're really, really good. And it's going to get better and better and better to where we notice them less and less and less. And it may become to a point where we're not even talking about this stuff anymore. It's just an automatic part of motorcycling that, well, of course it sorts this out. And of course it sorts that out. Like when you're talking about a car, you never talk about ABS in a car. When was the last time someone's like, oh, my car has the latest Bosch level 10 ABS? No one ever talks about that, but we still talk about motorcycling, because motorcycling is such a dynamic, rider interactive thing that it's important to us. But there may be a point where it becomes so seamless we don't talk about it anymore. And then what are we going to do for jobs?
Especially with the advent of electric motorcycles. I mean, you're just talking about, like, when's the last time someone talked about Bosch level 10 ABS in a automobile? But in electric bikes, like, you don't even talk about it. It's just, they're so integrated. It's an electric bike for what it's just that. Of course, electric bikes where I really see that. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. So it's going to get better. Don't be afraid of it.
Yeah,
the systems are better than you. I know we're going to have some comments, and we encourage you to let your comments out there, but there's 3 of us here, and I think all 3 of us agree that for the most part, rider aid systems are better than you are. They're better than we are, and you embrace it. And
we haven't always been that way, right?
We haven't always been that way.
But we get to ride so many things. We've got to see the evolution of this stuff. It's like, okay, yep. No, so, I get it.
Anyway, put your comments down below. Tell us about your experiences with rider aids, what you think of them, and tell us how good your wrist is. And thanks for watching, and we'll see you on the next one. So hit like, subscribe. It all helps for us to get this podcast out to more people, and we will see you next time.
Topic ideas.
Later. Oh yeah, give us more topic ideas. we're going to run out eventually. We've got a big long list, but our creativity is going to wane at some point. So help us out.